And it made me and a number of his other gay male friends angry and upset. Like, you're a gay man. Why are you marrying a woman? You're never going to have what you want. Hi, this is Mike Balaban. Welcome to another episode of BAMMER Tales. Today I'm going to share a story from the AIDS era in New York City in the early 1980s that involved a friend of mine and me. Obviously, a lot has been written about that era and the hundreds of thousands of gay men who tragically died because of this disease. This story is just one of many. I was a close friend of Paul Cavaletti. I'm using a made-up name to protect his family. I met him in 1979 at the YMCA where we were both working out. Paul was a Roman Catholic boy from an Italian family in Staten Island that never accepted him being gay. We didn't have a lot in common, oddly enough. I mean, he didn't have much of an education at the college level. He was naturally intelligent, but he wasn't on a professional track. And yet, our personalities were very similar in type. And we obviously found each other attractive, which is often what draws men together, gay men together at least, when they first meet. And it gave us some time to learn about each other, to hang out together and develop more than a formative friendship. Interestingly enough, we never actually consummated it sexually for deliberate reasons. As we started to get close and closer, we were hanging out together at places like the Saint Disco, where we would do mescaline and dance all night long, or Pershing's gay restaurant on the Upper West Side, where we'd have dinner and sit and just schmooze for hours on end, or other bars and gay hangout spots that were common and popular at the time. And as we got closer and closer, I introduced him to my other best friend, and Chris, and they got to know each other well. And I remember having the conversation once or twice, should we have sex? Should we go to bed together? Now, it's kind of telling that we hadn't already done it, I know. But the real question is why? And I think there were different reasons on both of our parts. I now know at this point in time that I'm demisexual. I didn't understand it then, but what it meant was I needed to feel a spark in addition to physical attraction to someone. It could be a chemical reaction. It could be a mutual camaraderie, just connecting on a certain level. I felt really close to Paul, but I didn't feel sexual about him. And he was gorgeous. He looked like a Botticelli statue. He, on the other hand, had had a number of relationships with gay men, all of which went awry. None of them lasted. Usually they ended unhappily. And I think on some level, in meeting me and getting close to me, he was fearful that if he had sex, it might jeopardize the friendship that we had so painstakingly established. So for our different reasons, we continued hanging out together, spending evening after evening together, and both being attracted to the other person on some level and deciding not to act on that attraction. In the early 80s, along came a woman whose name was Ronnie, who fell in love with Paul even though he was openly gay. And she refused to let that deter her. She spent a lot of time with him and with us. The evenings when the three of us would sit together eating and drinking and talking all evening were many. And along came the mid-80s. AIDS had arrived and begun to devastate our community. We each hoped we would be protected from it, but eventually Paul was diagnosed as HIV positive. And if I'm not mistaken, at one point even began to display symptoms of AIDS. And as you might imagine, that changed his mood about life. And in that process, Ronnie at one point asked him to marry her. And Paul thought about it and finally decided to say yes. And it made me and a number of his other gay male friends angry and upset. Like, you're a gay man. Why are you marrying a woman? You're never going to have what you want. And he said, Mike, I've been unable to get what I want through the many years that I was openly gay. And now I have a finite amount of time left. And I want to make sure that it's happy. And Ronnie loves me, and I love her in my own way. And so I'm going to do this. At first, Ronnie was upset with me because I tried to talk Paul out of it. But after I heard his explanation, I acquiesced and supported them, as did some of their other friends. And eventually they got married. And Ronnie, who had left the clothing business where she was quite successful for another career, went back into the clothing business and reopened a women's clothing company, which she named after her husband. And it was headquartered in LA, where their production factory was and warehouses were located. So they moved to LA, bought a nice estate with a big pool and a couple of llamas on it, and had a really idyllic lifestyle for a couple of years. I went out and visited them there. They came back to New York and visited me in my home, and everything was going fine until suddenly, out of the blue, I got word in 1990 that Paul had passed away. And that's the end of the story, except for the fact that today I got a text and then made a phone call based on that text to someone I'd never heard of before. This guy was another close friend of Paul's, who I'd either never met or had forgotten. And he doesn't remember meeting me, and we're both perplexed by that. But Paul did keep his friendship separate. That person was very close to Paul. They worked together at the Y for a while and would go out all the time and hang out all together and have all these kind of long night conversations. And then at one point, long after Ronnie came into the picture and began to get close to Paul, Paul came to this guy after work one night and in a very cold-hearted fashion says, okay, we've had a really good friendship, but I have to end it now. Which doesn't make sense, both in terms of the situation and Paul as I know it. And it made even less sense to this other guy who was crushed by it. And he's very spiritual, and now 40 years later, he still hasn't let go and healed from that loss. And he only found out about Paul's passing by finding the tribute that I created for Paul on the AIDS Memorial page, which led him to me today and led me to tell him my side of Paul's story and to hear his side, and to try to help him understand that the reason I think Paul was as cruel as he was to him in ending that friendship was most likely due to the fact that Ronnie found out about how close they were and may have felt threatened by him and essentially provided an ultimatum to Paul. Now, I'm totally making up reasons here, but it's the only thing I can think of to make sense for why the most genuine, sweet person I knew at the time would have been so cold for no reason. It made this person I talked to on the phone today feel better. We may eventually meet each other. At any event, it put a bow on the ribbon of Paul Cavalletti's life, how it ended, and the end of his friendship with this fellow 40 years ago. Thank you very much for listening. This has been another episode of BAMMER Tales, and this is Mike Balaban.